Welcome to the Practice Brave podcast. I am the host, Brianna Battles, founder of Pregnancy and Postpartum Athleticism and CEO of Everyday Battles. I'm a career strength and conditioning coach, entrepreneur, mom of 2 wild little boys, and a lifelong athlete. I believe that athleticism does not end when motherhood begins, and this podcast is dedicated to coaching you by providing meaningful conversations, insights, and interview topics related to fitness, mindset, parenting, and of course, all the nuances of pregnancy and postpartum. From expert interviews to engaging conversations and reflections, this podcast is your trustworthy, relatable resource for learning how to practice brave through every season in your life. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Practice Brave podcast. Today I'm here with Mindy English. She is a pelvic floor PT who also has a background in sports med and ortho PT. So it really helps to have these conversations about coaching and treating the pregnant and postpartum athlete or athlete mom with her, because she really has a scope of pelvic health, but also sports performance. And we live close to each other. So we get to do a lot of different collaboration. And if you missed it earlier, she's been on the podcast quite a few times now. And we are doing a series in 2025 that's all focused on different aspects of Ask a Pelvic Floor PT and different topics that Mindy and I can share and collaborate on. So with that, today we're going to be talking about incontinence for the female athlete, peeing when you lift, peeing when you jump, and different mechanisms to address that, and also the root of it. Why is that happening? Whether people have had a baby or not. I think a lot of times, and Mindy, you can correct me, but a lot of times people believe that, you just have a weak pelvic floor and you need to get stronger. But that is rarely the case with female athletes. And so we want to bring a little bit of nuance and explanation to that topic today. So Mindy, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me again.
Is there any context about your background that I left out that you want to add on for today?
I think sometimes when I think about like what makes my approach different, I also think about the fact that I've been in an athlete's shoes. I've coached also at a college level. I've coached like kindergarten all the way up through college, and then even people beyond that. And so I think when I first came out of PT school, I loved youth athletes. I still love youth athletes, but I always said I have a perspective from an athlete, I have a perspective from a coach, and I have a perspective from a PT. So I can kind of see all different sides of it. And I think now as I move into the pelvic health world, I think I still try and see it from all different sides, like understand where the athlete's coming from, understand where the medical profession is coming from, and then understand those people have coaches or have performance expectation, or understand where those people are coming from too, to try and just be an advocate in all different ways and figure out how we get these people performing at their best.
Yeah. And I mean, as you know, like you're kind of a unicorn because there's so many people that come to both you and I separately or even collectively that are like, my coach doesn't know how to help me, or I went to a pelvic floor PT and like they don't know what to do with me. And I've sent so many people to you for that same reason, my sister included, who lives out of state, and her PT straight up told her, like, I don't know how to help you any further. And I think it's really unfortunate that we're not able to better bridge that gap, because the way women work out now is not suited for the information of the pre and postnatal industry and the guidance that pelvic floor PTs traditionally give, which might be a lot more clinically based or rehab based. They don't know, oftentimes, not everyone, but how to bridge that gap from almost like pelvic floor rehab into applying it into like higher performance strategies, higher performance demands. And obviously that's what I try to teach in the certification program that I have, but bridging that gap into the practitioner community proves to be a whole other beast, as you well know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the thing I hear the most is I've been to pelvic floor PT. I just don't feel like they understood what I was trying to do. And that can be something like for us who, if you live in kind of a fitness world, like double unders doesn't seem like that far-fetched of an idea. But if you don't understand that world, you've never been in that world, double under sounds like, well, just don't do it. But if you do CrossFit competitions, double unders come up, and you can't just say, I'll just do single unders, I'll just do something different. Like, it just doesn't work that way. And so I think that's where people get frustrated, is just that lack of understanding or lack of curiosity or connection of let's help you find someone. And I think sometimes in the practitioner world, we get a little territorial. We'll feel like, well, I don't want a trainer telling my person about their pelvic floor, but that trainer understands the demands of the person's activity. And so I think we have to collaborate. We have to just be good teammates with each other to help the athlete in front of us. If you don't understand what they're trying to do, talk to them about them, ask them questions, see if they care, if you talk to their coach, we have to figure out how to help them so that they don't just leave the office feeling really frustrated and then feeling really defeated. And then they see stuff online. And if they're somewhere remote, they say, they just feel like they got less than, and they probably didn't necessarily get less than treatment from a pelvic floor perspective. They just didn't get that connection.
Right. And this is where I'm going to obviously do a shameless plug here for the certification, pregnancy and postpartum athleticism, because that is the bridge that, if you feel like you're not quite getting it from your coach or from your PT, your coach or your PT or even you can learn in the coach certification how to apply a lot of these concepts from the outside in, because not everything to do with your pelvic health symptoms or your diastasis has to do with, an internal assessment or things that you have to do like pelvic floor PT specific related. It can be a lot of coaching strategies, movement strategies, breathing adjustments, pressure distribution, tension adjustments that can be made from the outside in that affect your pelvic health in a really positive way. But those strategies have not been taught to us as female athletes from the get-go. We have not been taught how, different breathing strategies may influence our pelvic health symptoms. For example, I worked with an Olympic weightlifter a couple weeks ago, and she's a professional level. So she's very high level, great athlete. Obviously, her form is excellent, but her form and her breathing and Valsalva tendencies were not great for her current symptoms that had started more. She was absolutely not just leaking a little bit, but she was losing, totally peeing her pants on the platform to the point of having to wear a pad because she couldn't trust her body even at these meets. She's like, yeah, I would just always wear a pad because I knew after over a certain percent, I'd be peeing all over the platform. And even though that was very normal there, she didn't want that to be her thing. But she's like, I just knew that was going to happen once I reached a certain percent, if I was at my max. And then it started to kick up even more, even though she's taken a step back from competing a lot. She's noticed that her strategies, or maybe just getting older, certain things are just still making her pee to the point where she was like, I don't even want to, this is so discouraging. I don't even want to lift or push it to that level anymore, and bowing out of her workouts. And that's how we got connected. And it's not that she was lifting wrong. It's just sometimes your strategies aren't cohesive with what your body needs at different points in time. And that might be, symptoms might flare up a little bit more around the time of your period or ovulation, different points, obviously, in pregnancy and postpartum and menopause. And we're going to talk a lot about that today, but it is interesting knowing that, it's not always about a pelvic floor being the problem. It's almost the mechanisms, the sum of all of the variables that then affect the pelvic floor. So I know that wasn't a specific question, but can you riff off of that a little bit with what you've seen?
Yeah. I mean, I think we always assume that it's the pelvic floor, and we assume that, they must just have weakness there, or they're stretched out or whatever it is because they've had babies, and not everyone has had babies and leaks when they lift and do sports. And I think a lot of these athletes, when I see them, and if we do a pelvic floor exam, a lot of them actually do okay, right? Compared to the average person, a lot of them understand how to contract. They might not relax super well, but if you give them the right cues, they can kind of figure it out, but they still pee. And it's not because they're not necessarily like contracting at the right time in a lift. You know what I mean? Like sometimes there's just like other things that are happening at the bottom of a lift. And if you're like maxing out on a lift, that's a lot of load that you're just trying to put through your whole body. And there is a tendency, like you're breath holding, you're grinding it out, like you're just trying to stand up again. And so helping people figure out and kind of looking at it and saying, okay, like how else can we distribute your breath? And like you were saying with the Valsalva, there's a time and a place for a Valsalva. And like, you know, sometimes pelvic floor therapists are like, no, like let's not, like that's a lot of down pressure. And sure, it is. But sometimes people need a little bit of that and they need to distribute the pressure a little bit wider, right? Like we can still get kind of a similar effect with our pressure distributed a little bit wider. And then we also have to look at what else is happening, what's happening with their hips, what's happening at their ankles, what are all those other muscles doing to help them get up out of, if it's a heavy lift, if it's a deep squat position, how do we help them get up out of that? And no amount of like pelvic floor strength is going to help someone get up out of a max snatch or a clean or whatever it is and not leak. Like that's not pelvic floor muscles. They're robust, but they're not, those aren't your powerhouse muscles that are getting you out of there. And so I view it as it's a sign. And like, no pun intended, there's a leak in the system somewhere. And that's where that's showing up. For some people that could be pain. It could be knee pain for someone else. But for a lot of female athletes, it is leakage because they've reached their capacity and the pelvic floor just can't take any more of it and something has to give. But it doesn't mean that the pelvic floor is weak or that, you know, they need to use like vaginal weights at the bottom of their lift or something like that. Like that's not going to fix it.
No, absolutely. And so one thing I tell a lot of my athletes is like the pelvic floor has to be able to absorb force and produce force. And it does that not by acting as like a singular contraction, right? But more of a coordinated unit with the rest of that core system. We talked about that in last month's episode of just like how that core system works together. So if you didn't listen to that episode, that will be really helpful context for this conversation. But the pelvic floor has to be able to absorb, say we're talking about like a clean, for example, it has to be able to absorb that force of the catch at the bottom, absorbing that. And then as you start to grind out of that position shift, the pelvis goes through kind of a variety of range of motion there, really subtle. But that's where then it's having to produce that force coming out of the bottom. And that catch of the absorption into the transition into that production of force is a lot of demand on the pelvic floor. So this is a case for really needing to involve the glutes and changing the pelvis position in that range of motion to get the glutes involved more, because the glutes help with that absorption. So it's not just all going down to the pelvic floor. In a position like a clean, for example, it's kind of easy to go into that tucked under position. Think like of a butt wink position, or even if you're deadlifting and you get to that point right above your knees. And I call it, this is like a really unedited version of how I speak on social media is on the podcast, but like, it's like the dog shit position where like the back just kind of round, that pelvis rounds under. And that's where we see a lot of female athletes pee when they're doing deadlifts. And then same thing, if they're catching at really a deep squat at the bottom of a clean, and then they're transitioning up, that pelvis position being even slightly tucked under and that butt wink position can really put the pelvic floor in a position where it cannot absorb and produce that force well, because the glutes are no longer as involved. So if we can make a case for getting the glutes more involved in a lot of these movement patterns and small adjustments to that range of motion into their form, so to speak, that can go a long way. And not every athlete is going to be consciously able to make that positional adjustment in the moment. And that was one thing I noticed with Christy Brewer, she's the Olympic lifter that I just worked with, and I have permission to talk about her. For her, it was easier to cue a different breath strategy in certain positions because that automatically forced her pelvis into a different position. Automatically. And why? And I'd love for you to elaborate on this. But when I had her like exhale as she was transitioning out of that movement, it kind of forced her pelvis into a slightly different position. And she wasn't leaking anymore. So as she would like catch the clean, for example, she'd start to transition up out of the bottom with a little bit of a forced exhale. And that fixed her pelvis position and her symptoms without me saying like drive your hips back or get your butt back or anything like that. Didn't really need to do that. The exhale did enough to course correct her pelvis position and her symptoms in a lot of ways. So why does that work, Mindy?
Well, I think our brain loves new things. It loves like different strategies and different tasks. And so when we think of our body and movement, yes, we have our own volitional control over things that we do, but we also have this involuntary control that happens and involuntary movement patterns that happen with the brain. And so sometimes just cueing something different like gives our brain something different to like think about. And when I think of like that kind of butt wink position, there's lots of reasons for it. And sometimes it's just a neuromotor pattern that someone's learned. If we clear hip motion, we clear ankle motion, all those things, sometimes it's just a learned pattern from years of reps of doing it that way. You just find that's what worked when you first learned it. And so your brain goes, oh, like that's successful. I'm going to keep doing it. And so when we cue something like breath, when we just give a different focus, our brain, we're not like trying to override a system. Our brain's just like, oh, that's kind of different. And so it just kind of forces your body to adopt a different movement pattern that you already kind of know, right? Your brain knows all these different movement patterns. It just forces to change the order of activation of muscle patterns. And just, it can change your position pretty easily, right? And you don't have to sit and think about it. You don't have to sit at the bottom of a squat while you're like grinding it out saying, okay, let me untuck my butt.
Yeah. Or like contract my pelvic floor muscles. Like that's not going to work. But I was telling her like one thing that when you do that exhale, and I had her like do like kissing lips or like blowing through a straw, even like adjusting her lip position there, that exhale solicits that co-contraction of the pelvic floor. So it's kind of like a little bit of a super boost coming out of the bottom where there's this contraction, even if it's really subtle through that exhale, that gives you a little bit more support from the bottom of your core up. I mean, it's a muscular base. It all works together with that diaphragm. So again, it's like finding little tweaks to not just like what you're doing, but how you're doing that can make a really big difference for our athletes who pee when they lift.
Yeah. I mean, and even thinking about how we breathe is going to affect how some of our abdominal muscles activate, and that's going to have some attachments to the pelvis. And so that can alter some things a little bit too, just because you're just getting different activation of your abdominal muscles, again, without telling someone to tighten their core.
Yeah, because it automatically just forces, again, we're talking about how do we distribute and help that pelvic floor absorb force and produce force. It's not just the glutes, it's also like the abdominal wall too that can do so much for our female athletes when they are experiencing incontinence. So when we think about female athletes that are like, I don't know why I'm peeing, or this just started, or only happens sometimes, what do you tell them?
So I try and ask lots of questions to see, because sometimes it feels like there's not a pattern. And if you ask enough questions, there is a pattern that we can find. So, there is some value in saying that people are going to have some more symptoms at certain points in their menstrual cycle. But if you don't ask people those questions, they may not necessarily put that together. And sometimes you need, right? Like I might be seeing something like, well, I just finished my period. I don't know. And so it might be something that you have to come back to a month later and just see, okay, did you notice a difference here? Certainly different phases of life. So when we're postpartum, when we're perimenopausal, menopausal, that can be when symptoms start to show up. We're starting to discover those times where our estrogen is low. That can be a time where the pelvic floor is really just becomes more symptomatic for people, or not just the pelvic floor, but just in general, they become more symptomatic. Sometimes it can be at a certain point in their workout, right? So we have to start thinking about, is there a fatigue factor that's setting in? Again, if I think about, we'll just say, like your CrossFit athlete, because their workouts vary a lot more than maybe some other sports. It's kind of you start wondering, does it matter? Like the sequence of things. Like when something shows up in a workout, like again, double unders, it's a really common exercise that women leak with. Does it happen if it's at the beginning of the workout, or is it only if it's at the end of the workout, or does it matter? Right. Like, and so, I think for me, I think people know if you work with me, I'm going to ask you to play with your movement a lot. And I'm going to ask a lot of questions, and I'm going to ask like, how much variability can we have in the sequencing of things, just so we can figure out, like, I don't always know the answer for why you're leaking, and we need to be a detective a little bit to figure out, okay, what variables can we alter, right? Can we just alter timing of when this happens in a workout? And if we can, that's great, right? Like that's an easy thing to fix, at least for right now, right? Like as we work on some of the other things so that you can be strong at the end of a competition too. So I think we just have to get really curious and ask lots of questions. If you run, when in your run is it happening? If you stop and walk a little bit and then you start running again, do you start leaking again, or does it go away? If you're jumping, when in your jump, does it happen on a box jump? Right? Like, do you notice, are you leaking when you land? Are you noticing leaking as you start to swing your arms back to take off? Try and talk me through when you think it's happening. And if you don't know, then next time you do it, just like have some little awareness about it. Don't obsess over it. Just have a little awareness and then come back and let me know. Because when I think of your needs analysis, I need to understand where it's happening to be able to help you.
Right. And I think it even happens. I think what I've noticed working with different female athletes is sometimes they're surprised in the movements that happens. And they're like, well, it's not jumping, or, it's when I'm catching the barbell, like after doing the jerk, and you're like re-racking it on your shoulders. And it's that movement pattern that again, absorbing that force of the barbell with gravity, that's when they're leaking. Or it's toes to bar, and they're like, what? Like, I'm not even, it doesn't seem like my pelvic floor is really involved. But again, it's looking at a lot of different factors of what range of motion the pelvis is in and how it's having to exert that force, whether it's a really dynamic movement or it's a lot more of like a strength and grind kind of movement. If we're looking at like heavy lifting, that's more of like a longer duration force and effort on the pelvic floor, where something dynamic is almost like the speed and fatigue factor and like the automaticity, where then fatigue can kick in for other reasons. So, I think it's important to note that it really can happen in a variety of fitness and movement settings. And of course, not just limited to fitness. When you sneeze, cough, maybe laugh, or sometimes just even the urge to go pee and feeling like you cannot make it to the bathroom. And then a maybe not so commonly talked about symptom of incontinence is fecal incontinence. And that can be so humiliating, especially for female athletes who take a lot of pride in like not feeling limited by their body. And now they're worried about that, So, I think that's the really eye-opening piece of being a female athlete and now being a lot more, I guess, aware of how your pelvic health influences your performance across your lifespan. And pregnancy and postpartum are often just the seasons that bring more awareness, that highlight it, whether you are actually experiencing symptoms or not. You now officially kind of know what your pelvic floor is. Like, okay, it's been through a thing or two now, whether it's just the carrying of the baby through pregnancy. That's a lot of extra force in the man on the pelvic floor. If you have a vaginal birth or C-section, either way, you have a lot more awareness of the role of your pelvic floor in your daily life as well as your performance. And I think that's the eye-opening fact, is that you now have a lot more consciousness around different things that can happen, even if it's not immediately postpartum. Like you were saying earlier with perimenopause, different hormonal changes can affect your pelvic health across your lifespan. So there's a lot we can do proactively.
Yeah. And I think, I had someone who was pregnant say to me, like, I was talking to my friend about this, and she said, you need to see a pelvic floor therapist. She thought, but like, I thought this only happened postpartum. And, and it's just awareness that it does, it can happen even before you've had kids, and it just doesn't get talked about. I mean, I was a volleyball player, and I can tell you now, like, we didn't necessarily talk about it when we were like playing, but when I talk to volleyball players now, whether it's like teammates or just other volleyball players I interact with, they're like, wait, it's not normal to pee when I.
Oh, I know. It's so funny because like I feel like we've been just like, yapping for over a decade of like there's help and it doesn't have to be like this. But in every corner of the fitness industry, there's a way that it's been really normalized for women to pee. Like I was at a high rocks competition recently, and it's like there's this ongoing joke like, oh my god, I gotta go pee. And it's because like they're like 40 something minutes into the race, and they're like, okay, now their body's been through a lot of different, a lot of running, a shit ton of running, and then they go into a different movement, right? Like whether it's a sled or a row or a wall ball or whatever. So now their pelvic floor is having to go through a different demand than just the running. And almost like that change up can be really confusing and really hard on the pelvic floor. We see that in Olympic lifting and powerlifting communities of, again, kind of that normalization of peeing on the platform. And once you reach a certain level or a certain like load that you're pushing, that it's kind of inevitable that it's going to happen, whether you've had babies or not. Triathlon races, for a variety of reasons, sometimes people are just like shitting down their leg, whether it's because they don't want to stop, or sometimes it's because there's like a loss of control there that happens. Trying to think of other, obviously, CrossFit community and the double unders and the peeing before the workouts and stuff like that. Like we've just seen this so normalized in a lot of different fitness communities. And while obviously we're a proponent of female athletes being in the gym and wanting them to be successful and not making anything taboo or bringing shame there. Cause like, yeah, like if you pee, then that's like, we don't want it to be a limiting factor. And we don't want that to necessarily be like a normalized, this is just how it has to be when you work out. Cause there's actually things that you can do that doesn't bring you away from the movements you like doing. You can still train in those environments and lift heavy and do the double unders and compete in a high rocks race and do all these different things that might trigger symptoms. And we can troubleshoot a lot of different things to help improve your overall experience there. That doesn't say, or that doesn't mean like you have to stop doing those exercises or stop doing or stop competing or stop whatever. It's like, no, we just have to like reverse engineer this process a little bit, change a couple ways that you're doing it. That might be your form. That might be timing of your breathing. That might be just like how, like noticing where you're holding a ton of tension in your different movement patterns and redistribute that. And that alone can kind of be a quick fix. And I know none of this is actually a quick fix, but we got to give them a little bit of a win. And oftentimes, I don't know about you, but I find that there's at least a win that we can make, something that can be corrected easily early on. That like, again, it gives them that win of it. It creates a little bit of relief to their symptoms, maybe not permanently, but an improvement for sure.
Yeah. And I think it's just giving them that awareness of what their tendencies are. So many athletes hold their breath, and I'm guilty of it too. I tell people not to hold their breath all the time, and I get into a really tough workout, let's say with like rapid, box step ups or, whatever it is. And I'm like dying after 30 seconds. And I realize, well, yeah, because I just held my breath through the whole stinking thing. Right? Like that's the strategy my body chose to use. And so if you understand that, and then you just remind people, okay, like breathe during it, that can give them a quick win, especially if they maybe notice that they're leaking or they just have a lot of urge during it. Like, okay, well, let's just breathe during it and see, does that help? And I say that not to make it like so simplistic that it's just breathing, because it's not always just breathing, but sometimes it is just a little bit of, it's either a slight position change or just a change in your breathing for that quick win now, while we also work on these other things, right? If someone needs glute strength, strength gains are going to take 4 to 6 weeks to even start to become noticeable, right? And if I'm training for something, 4 to 6 weeks is a long time to feel like nothing is really changing. If the only thing I have to rely on is I just need to get stronger, right? Like there's some hope in that, but also, can I make some changes in my position, in my form, in my breathing, in my timing to give it a temporary fix while I still train?
Yeah. I absolutely agree. I think there's so much that can be done with just like a little like reassessment of like how you do things. And we can go through aspects of the PMPA principle. Again, I teach this like extensively in the coaching certification so that you understand like this is essentially an assessment for any female athlete. And again, we just tend to see the need for it a lot more during pregnancy and postpartum because that is where there are more vulnerabilities introduced. You are not fragile and you're not invincible. This strategy helps you learn to be a little bit more adaptable and helps coaches have like, I guess, like really practical ways of troubleshooting, right? Because I think we've always been told, well, just listen to your body, do what you've always done. Or like, well, if it feels good, you can keep doing it. Or if you're peeing, okay, stop. Or if you're coning, you don't want to do that anymore. Like, yes. And like, there are some things that we can work through as coaches to provide some suggestions and like understand what we're actually looking for and what we're working with. So the first one is breathing. And then we also look at pressure distribution. Then we look at tension and how that's also being distributed throughout the body. Then we look at position. So that can be like position of the pelvis or form or posture. And then we look at movement, how all of those different strategies are being applied to the movement at hand, whether that's double unders or lifting or re-racking the barbell, whatever it might be. Like, what is the movement that we're trying to apply all of these different considerations for? And those are the things that you're really trying to assess. And if you're making adjustment to the breathing, to the pressure, to the tension, to the position, then you should have a win with your athlete. If you're the athlete, you should have a win if you're making one or two small adjustments to any of those variables listed, because that little adjustment can make a big difference from the outside in. And that doesn't involve having to like, okay, I'm going to actively recruit my pelvic floor right now. Like, that's not going to work. That's not practical for athletic movements. And I think that's the bridge that has to be connected between your world in pelvic floor PT and my world in like sports and performance, where, you know, there's not that disconnect of like, wait, what do I do with my pelvic floor at this point in the movement? Or am I recruiting here or doing that? No. Like, we're retraining that brain and we're kind of looking at more outside in tactics that really improve the position and the overall function of the pelvic floor.
Yeah. And I think even like thinking about, okay, like I've tried all these different things. I'm still not getting a win. Okay, what's the regression? What's like one step back from this? Like, if I decrease the load, does that change anything? Does that change your strategy? Does that change your symptoms? If I do a box squat instead of a full range squat, do I have the same symptoms? Like, what do I need to train in the regression to help someone be successful? And I think sometimes we don't, I think in the public health world, we don't always think about that. It's like an all or nothing. Right? Like, if you like when you run, then just don't run. Well, what about like a run walk? Or what about a jog? You know, what if we're just not going as fast? Can we go the same distance and not have symptoms if we just like regress them a little bit? And I think, you know, for athletes, sometimes the regression feels like punishment for them. Like, I had someone the other day, she's like, oh, I have to do box squats. And I was like, that's great. Like, if you can still squat and just decrease your range of motion and not have symptoms, that's a great place to be right now. It doesn't take you out of the movement. You're still training a movement pattern. We just need to figure out how to get you past that, but you can still do it. And that's, you know, you just have to help people understand it's not forever. Like, everything, there's a spectrum. Everything is a spectrum. And right now we might be here because this is what your body needs for movement. We're going to get you back here, but we just need to take a step back while we work on all these other strategies to try and help your body be functional again. And I think sometimes we miss that, like, just take a step back.
Because it's hard because like we're literally programmed to think forward, like progressive overload, or well, like trying to get back, especially like our postpartum athletes are like, well, I just want to like be able to do this again or that again, or I used to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And so they're constantly thinking of moving forward. But sometimes, I mean, as an athlete in general, regardless of where you are, like you have to take a couple steps back in order to make progress forward. That is the nature of being an athlete across your lifespan, because it is not linear ever. It's not. It's linear for a particular season, And then there's a regression. Maybe there's an injury. Maybe there's just like a life variable, or maybe you're like, okay, I got to introduce a new skill or a new task that I'm working on. So you're going to be more of a beginner state again, or just, like maybe you're burned out and you're wanting to work something differently. There's so many different reasons for taking a step back that we can justify in some seasons of life. But it does seem that when it's on behalf of like your vagina, people are like, no, I can't do anything. I'm unwilling. I cannot do anything differently, because in the end, it feels taboo. Or like, I think there's the overall thought of like, I don't want to feel less than. Like, if we're as female athletes, like we've worked hard to be in positions where we've normalized competing and lifting and being really fit and feeling really strong in our bodies. And now to have like a vagina be a limiting factor, that just feels so wrong and vulnerable. And I don't know. I think that it's just like that is the mental piece of this for a lot of female athletes. And so I think we just have to normalize the fact that, like, if you are willing to take a couple steps back, it's not just that your pelvic floor function will improve, you will actually be a better athlete. You will perform better, period. Like, that is the missing piece. We just have not been taught how to coach female athletes with their anatomy in mind. Valsalva was not created with female anatomy in mind. It just wasn't. So again, it's not that Valsalva is bad. It's just there's a different way to generate pressure for the female body, especially if that female body is symptomatic. Like, there just is. And so we have to take a good look at a lot of sports performance strategies and recommendations. And a lot of our evidence isn't through the scope and lens of the female athlete body. Nevertheless, the female athlete body through pregnancy and postpartum and perimenopause, like, those are three substantial variables. So it really is just re-examining like what we've been taught and what we know isn't necessarily appropriate for a female athlete across her lifespan. So we just got to get creative with it. And that's certainly the work that you and I are doing day in and day out.
Yeah. And I think that's the key is you just have to get creative and kind of figure out, okay, like I may not have all the research to support this. I can extrapolate different pieces of research of what I know. And I know there's people doing some great research right now. Like I think from different podcasts I listen to and different people I follow, I know there is some great research that's supposed to hopefully come out in 2025 to help support our female athletes, which is awesome. It's a super exciting time for all of that. But until I have the research that says, yes, this is like how we do it, this is what we know, I have to take pieces of what I know from an orthopedic standpoint. I have to take what I know from what pelvic floor studies have been done and kind of mesh that together to try and get people their best outcomes. And then also what we see clinically with things, right? Like you try some things clinically, you get a win for someone. And then as a clinician, you kind of say, oh, that's interesting. Like, I wonder if that would work with this person.
Right. And that's like, I think that's the fun thing is, we get to notice patterns because we're actually coaching or treating people all the time, all the time. This isn't just like us spouting off a theory that we learned in school 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And I think that's a huge problem in both of our industries is either A, like not coaching women, not knowing anything about that, not having any updated information, or in your world, like not bridging into the fitness space at all and solely operating through the space of like pelvic floor work alone. But I think that there's so much we can do because we see it day in and day out. We're not being dependent on research. Like, we can be evidence informed, the evidence we do have, but ultimately when like coaching is creative, it's not always attached to some scientific methodology. It's like getting creative with the person and the body that you have in front of you. And there's so many people on social media. There's so many people teaching and selling. And this is like, a hill I'll die on, that I'm like, they're not actually coaching this population. They're trying to tell you how to coach this population and certify you to coach this population, but they're not coaching this population. They're telling people in their clinics, well, do this, do that, but they're not actually coaching them through that progression. They're just saying, well, like, try this and do that. And that's like the end of it. And then they don't see them again because that person doesn't come back because they're discouraged. So it's like, you got to stay in the game with your athletes to see that process all the way through. And then not just one athlete, do it with a multitude of athletes of all different sport backgrounds, because what might work with your Olympic weightlifter is not going to work with your jiu-jitsu athlete. Two different sports, two different demands on the body. And you got to be creative in how you're working with that population. And of course, that's what I try to like teach the different PNPA coaches that go through the curriculum, because there's no one size fits all strategy. But in the pre and postnatal industry, a one size fits all strategy is the scope in which exercise is taught. And same with pelvic floor PT. Like it is taught through a very particular scope, not a very creative one, not a really dynamic scope. And so it's kind of on us as the individual coaches, practitioners, and frankly, even the individual female athlete to say like, there's more to this and I'm willing to learn what that is.
Yeah, I think where pelvic floor PT misses is not doing like that needs analysis, which gets really honed into you. And you're doing it all the time when you're in an ortho and sports PT world. And even like in a sports performance world, you're always doing needs analysis. Like, what does this person need to be able to perform this task? And I think sometimes in pelvic floor PT, whether it's because of time or education or whatever it is, sometimes that it just gets missed, right? Like when we posted reels of like what a pelvic floor visit looks like for me, some of the comments from clinicians is, wow, that must have taken 2 hours. There's no way you can get that all done. And you can if you prioritize it and you listen to your athlete and you understand what they want to get out of that session that day.
Like, you know what you're actually looking for. Like if they're leaking in the catching position, then like simulate that in your session. Like you don't have to go through like the whole whatever prior to that necessarily, like maybe a few steps reversing from there, but there's so much you can do to just sort of like cut to the chase. Like, where's the problem at? Okay, it's not here. It's not when she's flat on her back. It's when she's standing up, and not just when she's standing up. It's when we're now adding like load and force absorption. Like we can get really practical and really crafty if we actually listen to them and not just our own like preconceived ways of doing things.
Yeah. And if you just like ask them, what's the most important thing that you get out of today?
Yeah.
Right. And so if I have someone who has pain and they're also leaking, if it's the pain that's stopping them from moving, I have to figure out what the pain is first. Like the leaking, yes, that's important, but I don't need to understand always why that leaking is happening on day one if they can't participate in their activity because they have pain, right? I have to like figure that piece out first and then figure out why they're leaking. But like sometimes it's like, oh, I have to figure out why you're leaking today. And they're like, well, I mean, maybe, but that's like not the thing that's stopping me.
Right. Like what's their priority versus like what's your almost assumed priority for them. Yeah. And then again, there's so much that we can really do to hone in on making small adjustments from the outside in. And I think some people automatically assume like, well, the only way I can stop peeing is if I get surgery or, but we know that that's like, I mean, that's not usually the case. Like there's again, so much more to this like neuromuscular connection and so many different pieces that we can look at to improve symptoms, both in like their daily life of coughing or laughing and sneezing to then having that be transferable to the movement that they're in. So why would surgery like not be the next right thing for them in most cases? Because I know that is a common thought of like, well, clearly my pelvic floor is just broken or weak. Let's fix it.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a place for surgery and sometimes people do need it, but it's not, I think if you haven't tried some conservative things first, it shouldn't be your automatic thought. I mean, I guess if you're looking for hope, like what you think might be a quick fix, but that's a pretty substantial quick fix, right? Like you have to think of like it's a surgery. There's a lot that goes into it, and people can have surgery and still leak and still have symptoms, and then they feel like, oh, my surgery failed, right? And then we get down the multiple surgery trail, which I think is a slippery slope.
And it's like more common than not for there to be those multiple surgeries. And most of the time, surgery on the pelvic floor is like more related to prolapse and the degree of prolapse. And then if there's the byproduct of maybe improving incontinence. But again, it's not certainly not a guarantee.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see people after prolapse surgery because they're leaking. Right. Like it's not as simple as it's made to seem. And, I'm fortunate to work with some great urologists in the area who are big proponents of pelvic floor PT and say, let's start here, and have that really nice teamwork approach of this is what I can offer you. And this is what pelvic floor PT can offer you. And then, if that's not working, then let's reconvene and figure out if we go back to some of the options that the urologist can offer.
Absolutely. And we'll be talking about prolapse and surgery and that scope of conversation in another episode. We really wanted to keep this focused around the nuances of incontinence and leaking when lifting or jumping and stuff like that. So we aren't going to really get too much into prolapse land just yet, but we will, because again, it's a common experience for female athletes that can show up across the lifespan, not just pregnancy, not just postpartum, but later on in life. So that's why we have to have some proactive strategies early on. Be proactive in your pregnancy, even if I think this is how I want to wrap up this episode, but even if you don't have pelvic health symptoms, I, for example, have never had any pelvic health symptoms. I just had a really significant diastasis. There's no get out of jail free card, right? At least not. There's something that affects somebody to some degree. But it's being conscious of the fact that this is a consideration for all female athletes of all ages because of our unique anatomy and the demands that we're putting on our anatomy. It is a consideration. It is something that we are predisposed to as women. Therefore, we should have awareness around our pelvic floor health as early as possible. This is things that we can teach our daughters, just to be a little bit more conscious of their pelvic floor or notice some of their tendencies early on. When people talk to me about trying to conceive, it's there's a few things that I'm let's start adjusting your exercise patterns in X, Y, and Z ways, or your breathing strategies here. So we're just kind of building new pathways and new options for them to work with, so that through pregnancy, as there's more weight on their body, as the position of the pelvic floor gets altered by the baby, that they're making kind of these proactive adjustments to their training on behalf of their pelvic floor health. So then when they go into birth, regardless of how the baby comes out, they've sort of set themselves up in the best way possible for that postpartum rehab. And your birth experience can create a lot of different pelvic health variables to recover from, whether you tear, depending on how long you pushed for, or you could have had the easiest, quickest birth, whatever, and still have a prolapse or still pee. Again, there's no get out of jail free card here with anything pregnancy and postpartum related. And that's not to scare you. That's just to say there's something that affects everyone at some point in time, just something. It doesn't even have to be in core public health related. There's just something. We all have a variable that trolls us a little bit at some point in time. And so then there's a lot you can do proactively postpartum. Again, even if you're not symptomatic, you can do it knowing, okay, my pelvic floor is really vulnerable right now. I could create a problem if I do too much too soon. If I'm not addressing these things, I don't want to be symptomatic. So I'm going to be really conscious of rehabbing and progressing my exercise well, of making some of those adjustments that I did during pregnancy and letting that transfer over into postpartum. And then again, like me, I haven't had pelvic health symptoms, but I know that, again, nobody is immune to this throughout their lifespan. So as I get older, I still want to be really aware of my pelvic floor health and know that, I don't want to have leaking. And if that's something I can control, then I'm going to be training in a way where I'm preserving my body as much as possible. Again, the variables, not everything is in our control, but if we can have more awareness, so then we can make more informed choices about our training and our progression, what to do and what not to do.
Yeah, it's just optimizing. It's optimizing our body and optimizing it in all realms. And like we talked about the last podcast, a lot of people just don't realize that there's muscles in the pelvic floor, that's a group of muscles. And so we do have to consider it, especially with certain activities. We have to think about what's happening there. And like you said, make the most informed decisions. Because I think when you have the education, not the shame, but if you have the education and you're making your best informed decisions, then you're not left feeling like, I wish I would have known. Right. And 10, 15 years ago, I think that was a much bigger trend of, I wish I would have known. I think more people know now, they just don't necessarily know what to do with it. And so if we can just continue to help people make those really informed decisions, because sometimes we just don't know. We don't know when that symptom's going to come up. We don't know when something's going to be a problem. It might not be right after you have a baby, it might not be immediately postpartum. It might be like 5 years down the line. And so we just have to help people make the best decisions for their body that they can. And that just comes through education and helping them understand that there are strategies, there are resources, there are considerations.
Yeah. Because again, like so much of our exercise science, so much of our sports performance was not created through the lens of the female body. And that's not to say that we need like some special treatment. No, it's just we need options and not limited ways of Valsalva or of like landing position or catching position, whatever it might be. Like literally anything within the exercise science, strength and conditioning, sports performance realm. There is not one right way. And we know that we know that as coaches. And I feel that gets very lost in translation when coaching female athletes, because they keep trying to hammer in the same way. And it's like, well, clearly that's not working. Or maybe it worked prior, but now she's had 3 kids and like that like breathing strategy, that pressure management strategy, it just doesn't work anymore. Okay, so like let's keep her lifting. Let's just change a few things, change how she's doing it. And that's really where we start to see those wins, where we're not trying to do the same stuff over and over and over. We get creative in doing the same things, doing the same movements, keeping her in the game, but just playing it a little bit different. Mindy, thank you for being here. I know if there's questions that stem from this conversation, send them to us and we will address them on our next episode. What we realized after the first episode is that people want the opportunity to like ask me or ask Mindy and have us kind of like troubleshoot their situations. And we want to do that, kind of like poll the audience and see if there's questions unique to your situation that you feel like you can't get a straightforward answer on. And we'd love to bring those to this series that we're doing on this podcast with Mindy as our like go-to Ask a Pelvic Floor PT or Ask Me. And together our brains, we can probably come up with some helpful suggestions that may be hard to get elsewhere. So if you have questions that stem from this episode, if there's something we missed, we'll be happy to include that info in future episodes. We're aiming to do this series one time a month where Mindy comes on the podcast and we just troubleshoot and talk all things pelvic health for female athletes. So thank you so much for listening. Mindy, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practice Brave podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review and help us spread the work we are doing to improve the overall information and messaging in the fitness industry and beyond. Now, if you are pregnant and you are looking for a trustworthy exercise program to follow, I have you covered. The Pregnant Athlete Training Program is a well-rounded program for pregnancy with workouts for each week that are appropriate for your changing body. That's 36 weeks of workouts, 3 to 4 workouts each week, and tons of guidance on exercise strategy. We also have an at-home version of that program. If you are postpartum and you're looking for an exercise program to follow, the 8-week Postpartum Athlete Training Program would be a really great way to help bridge the gap between rehab and the fitness you actually want to do. From there, we have the Practice Brave Fitness Program, which is an ongoing strength and conditioning program where you get new workouts each week and have a lot of guidance from myself and my co-coach, Heather Osby. This is the only way that I'm really offering ongoing coaching at this point in time. If you have ever considered becoming a certified pregnancy and postpartum athleticism coach, I would love to have you join us. Pregnancy and Postpartum Athleticism is a self-paced online certification course that will up-level your coaching skills and help connect the dots between pelvic health and long-term athletic performance, especially during pregnancy and postpartum. Become who you needed and become who your online and local community needs by becoming a certified pregnancy and postpartum athleticism coach. Thank you again for listening to the Practice Brave podcast. I appreciate you. And please help me continue spreading this messaging, this information, and this work.